Good morning, and I have two of many messages that I'd like to share with you. One, somebody suggested that you do come across as being very cynical when you tell people that they should go to church because that's where they belong. And number two, the suggestion is that you ought to have scripts that you follow. That way you'll come across as being more professional instead of speaking off the cuff, unscripted, chit-chat.
See, I told you, I do have friends who have my best interest at heart, and I like that, really. As for our little chit-chat, off the cuff, unscripted, I prefer to talk that way. Just what's on my mind, what's in my heart, because that's my style. And yes, I do make errors, and I do say things that I shouldn't, and sometimes I do come across as being cynical. But when I tell people that they should go to church because that's where they belong, that's because I believe that. For a lot of people, their moral compass comes from going to a place of worship. It doesn't matter whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. Somebody is in some place of worship, and that's where they're getting their moral compass. Okay, as for having a good scripted chit-chat, well, a lot of very effective propaganda were constructed or scripted and delivered in a very professional manner, but they did cause devastating results. For example, good people believed that the Jews killed Christ, and when you have somebody goes into a pulpit and keep repeating that, well, I don't have to tell you what the result was in 1940s. You know what happened when good people did nothing but supported a propaganda and people were killed. Which is what I wanted to talk to you about, morality. Just because something is morally correct does not mean that it is good and ethical. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the mid-19th century, around 1850 to 1860, a lot of the churches came together, and in history books will show that the Baptists were the leaders. But in fact, all the churches came together and agreed that slavery was morally correct because the Bible endorsed slavery. Now, you got to understand, these people believe that slavery was morally correct. 1854, I think, is when they had the big convention. But I correct myself. Not all religions believe that. Not all religions in the United States actually bought into that. The noted exception, of course, was the Quakers. I've talked about this before. But what is morally correct can have deep-rooted consequences. J. Edgar Hoover, for example, one theory holds that he was very, very secretive about a lot of things. One came out after he died, being a cross-dresser and all that. But there was another secret that was even more devastating, and that was that he was black. And this is one thing that he was embarrassed about and he did not want people to know. So his war against African Americans and against the civil rights was based upon his secret of being black, the theory that he was being black. So what he did to discredit the civil rights of African Americans, he called the movement communist, and he pursued African Americans wherever under the guise that civil rights was communist inspired, but a lot of people believe it to be correct. They actually believe that the civil rights movement had to do with communism and not the rights of individuals. And Edgar Hoover did that. Medgar Evans, for example, was murdered. 2 days later, the FBI knew exactly who did it, but he was never prosecuted for 20 years. Think about that. You've got to really understand so-called moral implications. To this day, what happens between a mom and her doctor still is considered morally wrong, even though there ought to be a confidentiality, and a woman ought to be respected as to what she does with her own body, and really a doctor's view on medical conditions should be respected. But there's a moral implication. A woman does not have the right to make her own decision based upon what is being told by her doctor. We have seen it on television where, with religious influences, women have been stoned to death because they had sex. Last week, again, it rose its ugly head. A woman was beaten publicly because she had sex, and that went against the moral code. You got to understand how moral codes are written and morality are written. Today, somewhere, somebody is worshiping in a church somewhere that still insists, mind you, that African Americans were ordained or were actually created to be slaves, and they used the Bible to justify that. Somewhere, a homosexual is being killed or murdered. It's a hate crime because it's justified by the Bible. And there you have it. A lot of the moral implications are based upon biblical edicts, but they're not correct. They are not right. Manifest destiny, which still governs the morality of this country, were written to eliminate Native Americans specifically, but it was extended later to really eliminate any race that was not Caucasian. Manifest destiny. Okay? And it had moral implication of being correct. Morally correct. But in fact, it wasn't. We sent the Great White Fleet all over the world to tell the world that God had ordained the United States as the one nation, and that nation, the United States, was ordained by God to be the superior nation. Think about that. Are we really? Well, anyway, I just wanted to tell you about morality, and I want you to think for yourself. Please, think for yourself. Today, as you go into your place of worship, consider what you're considering to be morally correct, and ask yourself, is it really? But you see, you can control people by giving it a stamp of morality. Be very careful. We kill people, execute people, because it's morally correct. And we have always done that. Whether we're burning people at the stake or just executing them for apostasy, we do so because it's morally correct. So here's what I'd like to ask you. What do you believe in that is morally correct and that is totally wrong? Remember 1956? In 1956, we had a resurgence of the civil rights movement. Later, it was made even more prominent. But in 1956, we had the country divided. Again, because morally, the churches were preaching that African Americans were slaves. They were not really human beings. And so you had a country half the country believed that it ought to be a United States of America. So on their license plate they would have United We Stand. The other half believed that African Americans were nothing but savages and slaves, and that was absolutely an edict from God. So they had a license plate, In God We Trust. And there you have it. A country divided based on morality, interpretation of morality. United We Stand, or In God We Trust. All I'm asking you to do is to think for yourself, because deep down you know what is correct. You do. All you have to do is to think for yourself. You know all about the implications of love and harmony, compassion, justice, equity. You know all about that instinctively. You don't need religion to know about that. So when you go to your place of worship, think about what you're being told in a very subtle way to support divisiveness, hate, anger, and what the CDC now calls the second most dangerous practice in the United States, systemic racism, which has its basis in being morally correct. There you have it.